In this chapter, I'll run you through most of what there is to know about programs and their relationship to samples. If you haven't already seen Chapter 2 on sampling, then it's probably wise to watch that before this episode, but it's not critically necessary. The links for all other chapters can be found in the description area below. If you find this series helpful, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave any questions or comments below. If you're new to the channel, then check out some of the other studio gear tutorials too. For those that already have some experience with this particular MPC, you can use the timeline markers to skip over what you already know. So let's start with the concept of programs, because if you've never used Akai samplers before, the term program might not sink in straight away. So to break it down into the simplest of terms, programs are a couple of things. Firstly, they're responsible for storing the settings for each of these particular pads, and pads can store things like tuning, volume, pan, output assignment, velocity, and a few other things that we'll cover later. And secondly, pads can also be used to trigger external MIDI devices too. So you don't necessarily need a pad to contain a sample, because pads can be configured to trigger your other MIDI gear, and so it's possible to get them to send out common MIDI messages like note and velocity information to other drum machines and keyboards that you might have in your studio. So it may help if you consider programs to be like commercial aircraft manifests, and your samples are the passengers. Then it's a simple matter of who's in seat 8-4 versus who's in seat B12 or who's in seat D16. And are they having the fish or the chicken? It sounds ridiculous, but programs are ultimately manifests of what samples sit where and how they play out with the additional features that these particular pads themselves can bring to the table. One thing to note is programs don't physically contain your samples. They simply reference the samples that are in the MPC's memory. For this reason, you can save and load sounds independently of the programs themselves, which for some may be tedious, but it does allow for many different possibilities for various workflows. You can have up to 24 programs in memory at any one time. Each program can store up to 64 samples each, and that's 16 per bank. And your pad banks are accessed via these bank buttons here, A, B, C, and D. So multiply that by 4 programs, which is what the MPC sequencer can accommodate at any one time, and that means you have up to 256 samples available simultaneously. If you have 32 megabytes of RAM installed, then you have quite a powerful and comprehensive production center at your fingertips. In a nutshell, the rule of thumb here is that you can't just play a sample directly from your MPC sequencer, but you can play programs which can contain the samples. And this relationship is a general rule that applies to most Akai samplers, which goes something like this. You load or record samples into the 2000, then you allocate those samples onto the MPC's pads via the programs. And you do that by editing the pad assignment page, which is accessed by pressing Shift and number 6 on the keypad. Then selecting any one of the 4 drum programs. Once you've assigned some samples to the programs, then you're in business. You can then start sequencing or recording your beats. But I'll be covering the sequencer in the next chapter, so check the links in the description area below. So getting back to programs. From the main screen, holding down Shift and pressing number 6 on the keypad brings you to the drum program select page. These are like your sequencer's drum slots. As mentioned earlier, the MPC sequencer has the ability to accommodate 4 different drum programs simultaneously. This is the page where we would allocate your drum programs to those 4 available drum slots, and then the sequencer can access them. So if we press the F1 soft key below drum 1, we arrive at the program edit window. Starting from the top left here, we have the name and number of the program currently allocated to drum 1. In this case, you can see that program 1 is named New PGM-A. If it's not selected, cursor over the program and press the Open Window button here. From this window, you can rename your programs, copy, delete, and create new ones. Programs also have the ability to be allocated a program change number, which is handy if you need to change a drum slot program mid-sequence to something else, but we'll cover that in the next chapter, which is on sequencing. If we close this tab here by using the soft keys and cursor down to the SND field, this is the abbreviation for sound. If you rotate your data wheel, you can scroll through the samples that you have in memory. Here you can select any one of your samples, and whatever you select will be the sound your pad makes when you tap it. In this case, that's the sound of A01. You can also use the play tab here to listen to the current pad that's displayed here as well. Cursor up to the pad field. By default, this will be set to A01, which represents this pad here. If you look to the right of the pad label, you'll see the note number, which is currently set to number 37. Now, this is a universal MIDI note number that represents a specific note on a MIDI keyboard, or possibly some other type of MIDI device. But you'll notice, as you scroll through the pad numbers, that the note numbers are not sequential. And that's because the pads on an MPC are laid out differently than keys on a MIDI keyboard. So it's probably a good time to mention that this window area where the sound label is also has a note number to the left of it. Now, this isn't something we can adjust here, but something we can use to browse through the numbers in numerical order, almost like a note number browser. You don't necessarily need to take much notice of these note numbers, but they do allow you to tap a pad and trigger external MIDI gear and vice versa. So these MIDI note numbers you see are also the pad allocations inside the MPC from external MIDI gear. So you could play a MIDI keyboard and trigger the sounds across the MIDI pads too. So it works both ways. But triggering the pads from an external device also means you need to configure that device to properly transmit the correct notes via the correct MIDI channel. If you prefer, you can force these MIDI note numbers into sequential order by visiting the Auto tab, which takes you to the Auto Chromatic Assignment page. Here we can get the MPC to adjust the note number allocations across the pads to follow a more traditional layout, like notes on a MIDI keyboard. And this is useful if you've got something like a piano sample in your MPC that you're intending to play a chord with. But before we do that, let's run through this exercise without a sample, so that we're just creating a program that features note numbers in a sequential numerical order. So on the Assign page, if I adjust pad A01 and make sure sound is set to off, now hit the Auto tab. In here, I'd leave all the settings as is because we're not messing with an internal sound anymore. We're just wanting the MPC to create a program that contains note numbers that are placed across the pads in numerical order, starting from pad A01. And just as a little side note, you could potentially save this as a default program so that your MPC turns on with this loaded in it automatically, but we'll cover that in a later chapter. So hit the Do It tab to create the program. Now check the pads on the new program to see how the note numbers are laid out. And you can see there that the note numbers are now running sequentially and numerically. So let's see what this is like with a real sample. So choose Program 1 and pad A01. Allocate a sound onto that pad. Jump back into the Auto page. Make sure your particular pad is displayed at the top of the screen, which it is. I can see the sound there, pad A01. And now I could tune the pad up a little or a lot if it's not exactly in tune with the key of middle C, and I can opt to change that there from the original key or the actual physical tuning of the sample too. And then I can nominate the name of the program that it's going to create. So again, I've covered this in an earlier chapter. So we'll just call that 1. Enter, and then hit do it. So if we check the new program, but let's check that via the params page, because I'll show you, if you keep your eye on the tune value in the top right, as I play through, you can see here in the tune field that the MPC has automatically created a program with a sample laid out like a keyboard, with my sound across every pad. And another cool thing that happened was that the MPC duplicated the settings I had on my original pad across all the pads in all the banks too. So if I had some intricate envelope settings on my original pad, the MPC would make copies of those settings across all the other pads too. We'll come back to the parameters page shortly, but let's just go back to the assign page and finish up with the note numbers. If we cursor up into the note field, we can manually change note numbers here, like this, just by using the data wheel, or punching them in on the keypad and hitting enter. And finally, there's another way to modify note numbers as well, which is pressing open window on that particular field. And like this, it gives you a bird's eye view of what note numbers are allocated to the pads of each bank. So and you could also cursor up and down using the cursor keys. So that pretty much covers everything about the note numbers. So we'll just get back, we'll close out that window, get back to the assign page. Moving up to the top right of the assign page, we have the pad assign feature here. This allows us to choose a customizable program layout. By default, it's set to program, or you could select master with the data wheel, which overrides the pad to note layout for all drum programs. So it's best to leave this set to program in most cases, but it is useful if you need to initialize your program if you've messed up all the note assignments. And you do that by clicking open and hitting do it. And if you keep an eye on that note number there, you'll see it's back to normal, and we've lost that chromatic assignment. So let's cursor down to mode where things get a little bit more interesting. Now that we've covered a bit about the note numbers that are associated with each pad, we can now make full use of those numbers here with the different types of modes. By default, we have normal mode. Using the data wheel to scroll through the options, the next option is simultaneous mode, which is intended for playing other samples simultaneously, along with the sound that is already on a particular pad. So essentially, we can have up to 3 sounds layered per pad with this simultaneous feature set to on. Then you would select the note numbers of the sounds you have on other pads. Not the pad number, but the note number. So this is where the understanding of note numbers comes in handy. So that one's 82. If I go over to also play note, use the data wheel, put 82 in there, or use the keypad. And then I could choose another sound again to layer on top of that. So again, it's note 42. So click this, dial in 42. Okay, so you get the idea. The next option in the mode list we have is VEL-SW, which is the velocity switch. And this gives us the ability to layer samples and access any one of 3 sounds depending on how hard we hit that particular pad. And we can adjust the crossover of the velocity here with these particular numbers in here. So if I hit it quietly, you get one sound. If I hit it a little bit harder, I get that one. If I hit it really soft, and you can adjust again using note numbers. What note number is that? 843. So I put 43 here. Last in the mode list, we have the decay switch, or DCY-SW. This gives us control over the decay of 2 layered sounds, which is good for shortening hi-hat samples, as this mode uses velocity and decay with the use of the note variation slider. It's a little strange, but you could definitely get something out of it. So go ahead and experiment with it. You may be able to use it for something a little crazy. I'm not too sure if it was implemented correctly, but it does work. I just didn't find it as useful as the other 2 multi-modes. And look, while we're here, I'll show you a useful tip. If you hover over or cursor over the note field on the lower half and hit the open window, you get the copy note parameters page. This is a handy feature because if you've done some labor on setting up some sounds across various pads and you want to make some variations of those or backups, rather than reprogram another pad from scratch, you can copy a pad that you've previously configured to another pad somewhere else, which is handy if you want to make a few pads of the same sound with slight variations, or in between, like hi-hats or a ghost note snare that has a slightly softer version than the original. This option is also available to you in the parameters page, which we'll cover next as well. Okay, so now let's visit the Params tab, which takes us to the parameters page. And from the top, you can see the currently selected pad. Or you can tap another pad to select something else. You can also cursor left over to the PGM number and scroll to another program from here as well. Or you can hit the open window, and here you can delete, copy, create a new program, rename an existing program. But I've covered that all in the first chapter, which is called Navigating Your MPC. So I won't bother covering that again here. I will, however, quickly show you how to delete a program. And you do that in here. I'd select number 3, because we don't need that. Hit open, delete, and I could choose all PGM if I wanted to delete all the programs in memory. Wouldn't delete the samples, it would only delete the programs. So I'll just delete number 3, and now we've only got 2 left. From the top right, we have the tune field. This is fairly self-explanatory. You can punch in a number on your keypad, or you can dial in an amount on your data wheel. You have up to 240 cents. From memory, I think it was a value of 10 that equates to a semitone. So and if you press the open window, you get some extra options here. You can make use of this velocity to pitch feature by dialing in an amount in the velo pitch field. And again, you can use your wheel or a keypad. Here, a smaller value will apply less of an amount to your sound based on how hard you hit the pad. You can apply up to 120 units of positive pitch, or you can reduce the pitch down by using that same amount but in a negative number. And you've also got access to the main tune. As well. I sometimes like to use a little bit of that velocity pitch on things like hi-hats and stuff, just a tiny amount, just it livens it up, or it's quite handy with things like ghost notes because it just adds a little bit of a virtual movement to a sound. So check that out, experiment with different sounds with that particular feature. Below tune, we can cursor down to the voice overlap field, which we can use the data wheel to select other options rather than poly, which is the default. We also have monophonic, and I need a long, this one. So you can hear the three notes overlapping when it's in poly, but if it's in mono, it cuts itself off. So in mono, it'll restrict itself to just one voice, but as the MPC2000 has 32 voice polyphony, if I was to put that in poly, I could hit that 32 times and it would sort of tail over itself 32 times. And the last available option in the list is note off. Generally, you will see note off if you have edited a sample to be a loop on the trim page. So see my chapter on sampling on more about loops and samples, but the note off option is basically going to play your sample continuously until you let go of the note. Hitting the open window on the voice overlap brings you to the mute assignment, where you can configure your pad to mute up to 2 other samples. So if you had a long open hi-hat, you could configure this to be a closed hi-hat that mutes the open hi-hat, or something to that effect. It's quite a useful feature, so make sure you check it out. To the left of the tune area, we have the filter, which is also a bit of fun to use. You can crank the resonance up to 15 maximum. I'll give it a shot at about 11. And then slowly pull down the filter, and it gives you like an analog synth style of cutoff frequency. But the good thing about the filter on this is that it's not just static. So you can hit open window and then dial in some velocity frequency and then shape an envelope. Like so, you've got a filter envelope. So if I add some decay, it should round out, and then add a little bit of an amount. So you can set up a basic envelope shape and crank up a bit of velocity frequency. And now when you strike a pad, the harder you hit the pad, the more your filter envelope will open and close over the course of your sound. So you can get some really interesting effects from this feature. Make sure you jump in and experiment with it. Just remember to add a little bit of an amount and try out different velocity amounts across different samples. Depending on the content of your sample, you may need more or less of one or the other. So there's no real right or wrong here. It's just a bit of fun to play around with and see what we can get out of it. Next, we have the amplitude envelope, and similar to the filter envelope, you can shape your sample with the basic envelope. So your attack here is the time it takes for the volume of your sample to rise up, and with a larger value, the longer the attack time. And then the decay is the time it takes to die out. And you also have decay mode, which is this DCYMD here. And by default, this is set to end, which applies the end of the decay to your sample's finish point. It does this intentionally so your samples can finish out smoother than having your envelope the other way around. But you can flick that to start, which then everything sort of rushes off the start. So again, a higher decay amount. And you can also add attack on that too. And just like the filter envelope, the amplitude envelope also has an open window set of options as well. And just to quickly run through these, the velocity attack, obviously with a larger value or heavier value, you can slow the attack down. So this is the amount that's registering when I hit at the moment. Now an interesting thing is you might know full level already, which just gives the pads the loudest amount of velocity when you tap them. But if you turn full level off and you zero the velocity level, that's kind of like actually putting full level on your particular samples or pads. So if I put that back to 100, I can tap it lightly, or at 0. No matter how light I tap it, it's always just going to come out at 127, which is maximum velocity. And the middle one here is the sample start time. So this is interesting too, because I can, if I put that back to where it was, this alters where the actual sample is starting based on how hard you're hitting the pad. So you'll get some interesting effects out of that too if you experiment with that. So that's almost, there's a drum in the Purge. So if you look at Purge, this is a handy utility because what this does is it will purge all the samples that aren't part of a program. So it will sort of cleans up your memory a little bit if your MPC is dying or running out of RAM. And you can see here it says pressing do it will erase all sounds not used in any programs in memory. So there's 6 sounds that aren't used in any programs. If I click do it, it'll erase, and now it says 0 sounds not used in any programs. So it's basically purged everything that was homeless. There's also the drum tab, which we haven't really covered, and we can quickly go in and have a look. It's mainly about using an external sequencer. So it has features to disable the internal pad sounds, which is up here on the top right. but you can use an external sequencer without disabling the pads anyway. So I'm not sure how useful this page is going to be to many of you. And you can disable the program change reception, add the MIDI volume reception as well by selecting ignore to both of these. So again, not a big addition in features for the MPC2000, but regardless, it's there. So that's about everything we have for this chapter on the MPC2000. I hope you've picked up some useful tricks along the way. If you have, please give the clip a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can check out future episodes. Also jump on to the ToneLab Instagram and Facebook pages at ToneLab3000. Links in the description for those. And thanks for watching and take care out there.